The alarms went off before I even opened my eyes. Not the soft chime we used for drills, but the sharp, grinding siren that meant something had gone wrong in a way nobody had planned for. I was still pulling my boots on when Grace Hollis burst into my quarters, her face pale under the emergency lighting. "Colony link to Meridian Station is gone," she said. "Not delayed, not glitching, gone." I remember the cold feeling that settled into my chest at those words. Meridian was not some small outpost. It held nearly 40,000 people, families who had left Earth only 3 years earlier to build something new under an alien sky. I ran to the command deck with my uniform half-fastened, and by the time I reached my station, the screens told a story I did not want to believe. The colony's orbital relay had stopped transmitting. Every ship, every automated satellite, every beacon that should have been sending updates back to Earth had simply stopped speaking. It was not static, it was silence, complete and deliberate, the kind that only comes from something being taken apart on purpose. I want to explain something before I go further, because it matters for everything that happened after. When humanity first reached the wider galaxy, we believed we were joining a family. We had spent centuries dreaming about first contact, imagining wise alien elders welcoming us into a peaceful community of stars. What we found instead was a vast council of species who looked at us the way a crowded room looks at a child who has wandered in uninvited. Polite, distant, amused. We were the newest members of the Galactic Council, and by their measurements the weakest. Our ships were slower. Our weapons were considered primitive. Our fleet was small compared to empires that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Diplomats from 100 worlds smiled at our representatives during meetings and then quietly agreed among themselves that Earth would need to be watched, managed, and kept in its place. Among those who watched us most closely was a species called the Crithani. They were an old power, proud of their military history, and they saw humanity the way a hunter sees a wounded animal separated from the herd. Not a threat, an opportunity. I did not know any of this history mattered in the moment I was staring at empty screens where a colony used to be. All I knew was that 40,000 of our people had gone silent, and nobody could tell me why. Admiral Marcus Doyle arrived on the command deck minutes after I did. He was a calm man by nature, the kind of officer who rarely raised his voice, which made the tightness in his jaw all the more frightening. He asked for a full diagnostic, then a second one, then contacted 3 separate relay stations to confirm the signal loss was not some equipment failure on our side. It took 4 hours before we received anything at all from the direction of Meridian. What arrived was not a distress call. It was a formal message, transmitted through council channels, from the Crithani Dominion. I remember Daniel Pierce, our communications officer, reading it aloud in a voice that shook slightly despite his effort to keep it steady. The message stated that Meridian Colony had been relocated under Dominion resource claims, citing an obscure clause buried deep within Council law that allowed unclaimed or underdeveloped territory to be repurposed by any recognized member species. It said nothing about the people who had been living there. It offered no casualty figures. It simply informed us that our colony now belonged to someone else, and suggested we file a formal complaint through the appropriate council channels if we disagreed. I remember the silence that followed on our bridge. Not shock exactly, something colder than that. The kind of quiet that comes right before people stop asking questions and start looking for answers on their own. Admiral Doyle asked for reconnaissance data. What we received back, hours later from a scout drone that had barely escaped detection, showed a colony stripped of nearly everything valuable. Structures torn apart, supply depots emptied, and worse, evidence that the Dominion had used weapons designed not just to conquer, but to remove any possibility of resistance from the people who lived there. I will not describe every detail of what that drone recorded. Some images do not need to be repeated to be understood. What I will say is this: whatever the Crithani expected from Earth after that message, it was not what they got. Because here is something the Council never bothered to learn about us. Humanity's entire history was built on conflict. We had fought wars over land, over resources, over pride, over almost nothing at all, for thousands of years before we ever left our own solar system. We had learned, through terrible cost, exactly what it took to survive against an enemy who believed you were too weak to fight back. The Crithani thought they were dealing with a naive new species that would beg for compensation talks and accept whatever terms the council offered. They had no idea they had just made the worst decision in their long history. I remember Admiral Doyle turning to face the bridge crew. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had shouted. "Get me Earth Defense Command," he said. "Tell them Meridian is gone. Tell them we are done talking." Grace looked at me from her station, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized because I felt it too. Not fear, not anymore. Something that had replaced the fear entirely, cold and absolute and completely without hesitation. Within the hour, encrypted transmissions were moving across every human vessel in the sector. Not requests, orders. And somewhere far away, in the polished halls of the Galactic Council chamber, delegates from 100 worlds continued discussing procedural matters, completely unaware that the newest, smallest, most easily dismissed member of their community had just stopped listening to them entirely. The Crithani expected negotiations. What they were about to receive was something the galaxy had never seen before and would never forget. I did not sleep for the next 3 days. None of us did. Earth Defense Command had activated protocols that most of us had only read about in training manuals, plans written decades earlier by strategists who had always hoped they would never need to be used. I sat in briefing after briefing, watching maps of our small sector of space fill up with markers representing ships that should never have needed to exist. Laura Bennett, our chief tactical officer, was the one who explained to me exactly how far behind the Crithani were in understanding what they had started. She had spent years studying old Earth conflicts as part of her officer training, something the Council considered a strange and unnecessary use of time for a species trying to look civilized in front of older empires. Now that same knowledge was the only thing standing between us and complete disaster. "They think this ends with a treaty," Laura said, pointing at a display showing Dominion fleet positions. "They are moving support ships toward Meridian to begin full resource extraction. They believe we will spend the next several months arguing in council chambers while they finish taking what they want." Nathan Cole, one of our younger pilots, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What happens when they realize we are not doing that? Laura did not answer right away. She simply looked at the star map, then at Admiral Doyle, who gave the smallest nod I had ever seen a commanding officer give. "We do not wait for them to realize anything," he said. "We make sure they understand immediately." What followed was unlike anything the Council had ever authorized, mostly because we did not ask for authorization at all. Earth had spent years quietly building infrastructure the wider galaxy assumed was purely civilian. Cargo haulers with reinforced hulls, mining vessels equipped with heavy cutting arrays originally designed for asteroid work, colony transport ships built with redundant systems that made them nearly impossible to disable with a single strike. None of this had been built with conflict in mind, not officially. But humanity has always had a talent for looking at ordinary tools and finding new purposes for them when the situation demanded it. Within 72 hours, dozens of these vessels had been quietly repurposed, mining lasers recalibrated for far more precise and forceful applications, cargo holds stripped out and replaced with equipment few outside our own engineering corps had ever seen in action. I remember standing in a hangar bay watching Owen Marsh, one of our senior engineers, oversee the retrofitting of a transport ship that had been hauling grain to outer colonies only a week earlier. "People keep asking me if this is legal under council regulations," Owen said without looking up from his work. "I keep telling them I stopped caring about that when Meridian went dark. It was not just the ships, it was the tactics. Council warfare, from what little our diplomats had observed, followed patterns that had not changed in centuries. Formal declarations, staged engagements, rules about which targets could be struck and which were considered off-limits by mutual unspoken agreement between old, established powers who had long ago decided that total conflict was too costly for anyone to risk. Humanity had never operated under those same assumptions, because our own history had taught us a very different lesson. War, when it came, either ended quickly and decisively, or it dragged on and cost far more than anyone could afford. We had learned, through generations of conflict on our own world, that half measures accomplished nothing except prolonging suffering. If a fight could not be avoided, then it had to be finished as fast and as completely as possible. Admiral Doyle called this philosophy total resolution, and it became the foundation of everything Earth did in the days that followed. I was assigned to the flagship that would lead our response, a modified cargo hauler renamed the Meridian's Answer, a name chosen deliberately by the crew rather than any official naval committee. Grace Hollis served as my second in command, and together we worked with a crew that had, only weeks earlier, been running supply routes between farming colonies. None of us had trained for this in any conventional sense. All of us understood exactly what needed to be done. Our first target was not the Krathani fleet occupying Meridian itself. Laura had been clear about the reasoning behind this decision, and it stuck with me because of how coldly logical it was. Striking the occupying force first would only trigger reinforcements from Dominion territory, drawing out a longer conflict with more opportunities for things to go wrong. Instead, our first move needed to remove the Krathani's ability to reinforce at all. That meant a forward staging base the Dominion had established at a location the Council star charts labeled only as Threshold Station, a heavily defended waypoint positioned between Dominion territory and the region surrounding Meridian. Every ship, every supply convoy, every reinforcement the Krathani intended to send toward our colony would need to pass through that station first. Take away their ability to reinforce, Laura explained during our final briefing before departure, and Meridian becomes an isolated garrison with no support and no way to call for help. Whatever happens there afterward becomes a conversation between us and a fleet that can no longer expect rescue. Daniel Pierce, still serving as our lead communications officer, raised a question that I think all of us were thinking, but few wanted to say aloud. What happens to the personnel stationed at Threshold once we arrive? Nobody answered him directly. Admiral Doyle simply looked around the room at each of us, and I understood, without needing the words spoken, that this mission would not follow the polite, unspoken rules the rest of the galaxy had grown comfortable with. We were done playing by rules that had only ever been designed to keep older, more powerful species safe from consequences. As our ships prepared for departure, word reached us that the Galactic Council had finally convened an emergency session to discuss the situation at Meridian. I remember Grace reading the summary of that meeting aloud to the bridge crew and the bitter laughter that followed. The Council's official statement encouraged both parties to pursue diplomatic resolution and reminded all members that unilateral military action was strongly discouraged under interspecies cooperation agreements. Grace set the datapad down and looked at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and grim amusement. "They still think we are going to ask permission," she said. I did not answer her. I simply gave the order to begin our approach toward Threshold Station, knowing that somewhere far away, delegates from 100 worlds were still debating procedure, while our fleet moved through the dark toward a confrontation none of them had prepared for. The Krathani believed they understood humanity. They believed our species could be measured, categorized, and dismissed the same way every other council member had been measured and categorized for thousands of years. They were about to learn that some lessons could only be taught once, and that Earth intended to make certain nobody in the galaxy would ever need that lesson repeated. Our ships entered final approach vector 12 hours later, running dark, engines throttled down to minimize any signature that Dominion sensors might catch. I stood on the bridge of the Meridian's Answer, watching Threshold Station appear on our long-range scanners for the first time, a cluster of structures and docked vessels glowing faintly against the black. Somewhere on that station, Krathani officers were likely still congratulating themselves on a swift and successful operation at Meridian, confident that whatever response Earth mounted would arrive through proper diplomatic channels months from now. They had no idea we were already here. The order to begin came from Admiral Doyle himself, transmitted across every ship in our small fleet at the same moment. There was no countdown, no dramatic announcement, just 3 words that I still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. Begin the approach." Grace stood beside my chair on the bridge, her hands steady despite everything. Around us, the crew of the Meridian's Answer moved through their stations with a quiet, focused intensity that I had never seen from them before, not even during the worst supply route emergencies, back when this ship still carried grain instead of weapons. Threshold Station grew larger on our main display as we closed the distance, its defensive perimeter marked in red across our tactical readout. Laura Bennett had spent the last several hours studying every scrap of intelligence we had gathered on the station's defenses, and her assessment had been simple and direct. The Krathani had built Threshold to intimidate smaller, less organized threats. They had never imagined a force willing to strike with total commitment and no plan for retreat. "Their shield generators are concentrated on the outer ring," Laura said, pointing to 3 glowing sections on the projected model. "If we take those out first, everything behind them becomes vulnerable within minutes." Nathan Cole and the other pilots had already reviewed the strike patterns dozens of times during the approach. I remember the calm in his voice when he confirmed readiness, a calm that surprised even me, given how young he was and how little any of us had trained for something on this scale. "Fighters ready for launch," Nathan said, "waiting on your order." I looked at Admiral Doyle's image on our secondary display, patched in from his own command ship several kilometers away. He gave the signal, and I relayed it to my own crew without hesitation. "Launch fighters, begin the assault." What followed was unlike anything the Krathani command staff at Threshold Station could have anticipated. Our fighters came in low and fast, using approach vectors borrowed from old Earth naval tactics that dated back centuries, patterns designed to slip past detection systems built for conventional, predictable engagements. The Dominion's sensor operators, according to communications we later intercepted, did not register the incoming strike until it was already inside their outer defensive perimeter. The first target was the shield generators Laura had identified. Precision strikes, delivered with a speed and coordination that Council military doctrine did not account for, disabled 2 of the 3 generator clusters within the first 90 seconds of engagement. I watched on our tactical display as the protective energy field around Threshold Station flickered, then collapsed entirely across nearly half the structure. Grace's voice beside me was tight with focus. "Shields down on sectors 2 and 3, Krathani vessels scrambling for launch." It was too late for them. Our secondary wave, a group of retrofitted transport ships, equipped with the same mining lasers Owen Marsh and his engineering teams had recalibrated days earlier, moved into position exactly as planned. These were not elegant weapons, designed for precision duels between warships. They were tools built to cut through solid asteroid rock, repurposed now for a very different kind of demolition, and they tore through the exposed sections of Threshold Station with a force that Dominion armor plating had never been designed to withstand. I will not pretend that watching this unfold was easy. Even with everything the Krathani had done at Meridian, even with the knowledge of what had happened to the people who lived there was a part of me that flinched at the scale of what our fleet was doing. But I also understood, with a clarity that only grew stronger as the battle continued, that half measures would accomplish nothing. If Earth struck Threshold Station and left enough of it standing to rebuild, the Dominion would simply try again in 6 months, or a year, with a larger fleet and a clearer understanding of what to expect from us. Admiral Doyle's voice came through on the fleet channel, calm and measured, even as reports of destruction poured in from every direction. "Continue the operation, full commitment, no half measures." Daniel Pierce, monitoring communications from his station, suddenly called out with an urgency that cut through the noise of the bridge. "Incoming transmission from Threshold Station Command. They are requesting a ceasefire." I remember the silence that followed those words. Every officer on the bridge turned, if only for a moment, to look at me and then at the display where Admiral Doyle's image remained steady. "Patch it through," Doyle said. The voice that came through our speakers belonged to a Krathani officer identified in our records as Fleet Commander Vresk, one of the senior Dominion officials responsible for coordinating the operation against Meridian. His translated words carried a tone that I can only describe as disbelief mixed with something close to fear, an emotion I doubt his species had expected to feel when dealing with humanity. This action exceeds acceptable parameters of interspecies conflict, Vresk said. We request immediate cessation and formal negotiation through council channels. I looked at Admiral Doyle's face on the display, and I saw none of the hesitation that I might have expected from a species raised on centuries of careful diplomatic caution. His answer was calm, and it was final. Your forces destroyed a civilian colony of 40,000 people and offered us a filing form in response, Doyle said. There will be no negotiation. There will be a lesson, so that no other species in this galaxy ever considers our people an easy target again. The transmission ended abruptly on the Krathani side. Whatever Vresk had expected to hear, it was clearly not that. The battle continued for another 2 hours, though calling it a battle almost feels inaccurate, given how quickly the balance had tipped. Our forces methodically dismantled Threshold Station's ability to function as a military waypoint, targeting supply depots, communication arrays, and vessel repair facilities, with a precision that left the underlying structure of the station intact, even as its military value was completely eliminated. This was deliberate. Admiral Doyle had been clear from the beginning that our goal was not simple destruction for its own sake, but the complete removal of the Dominion's ability to project further force into our sector. I remember Grace turning to me partway through the engagement, her voice quiet enough that only I could hear it over the noise of the bridge. They are not fighting back anymore, she said. Most of their ships are just trying to escape. I gave the order that I knew Admiral Doyle would have given in my place, the order that reflected everything Laura Bennett had taught us about total resolution and what it actually meant in practice. Let them go. Our objective was never to destroy every ship in that fleet. Our objective was to make sure they never come back. By the time our forces disengaged and began the withdrawal back toward friendly space, Threshold Station had been transformed from a functioning military waypoint into a hollowed-out wreck, incapable of supporting any further Dominion operations in our direction. The Krathani vessels that survived the engagement fled deeper into their own territory, carrying with them reports that would soon reach every corner of Dominion space, and eventually, every member of the Galactic Council. What none of us fully understood in that moment was just how far those reports would travel, or how completely they would change the way the wider galaxy viewed humanity. I learned later, through intercepted Council communications that were eventually shared with our diplomatic staff, that live sensor feeds from several neutral observation platforms near Threshold Station had captured much of the engagement in real time. These feeds had been automatically relayed to Council monitoring stations as part of standard interspecies conflict oversight protocols that existed specifically to allow the Council to intervene in disputes before they escalated too far. By the time anyone on the Council realized what was happening, the engagement was already over. I remember sitting in the debriefing room aboard the Meridian's Answer several hours after the battle ended, listening to Laura Bennett summarize the operation's results for the official record. Threshold Station's military capability had been reduced to nearly nothing. Dominion casualties were significant, though far lower than they could have been given the scale of destruction inflicted on the station's infrastructure, a fact that Admiral Doyle had insisted on throughout the planning process. Our own losses were minimal, a handful of damaged fighters and no destroyed vessels, a result that surprised even our own tactical staff, given how aggressively we had pressed the engagement. Nathan Cole, still slightly breathless from hours in the cockpit, asked the question that seemed to hang over the entire room. What happens now? Nobody had a complete answer, though Admiral Doyle offered something close to one during his final address to the crew before we set course back toward Meridian to begin the process of liberating what remained of the colony. Now, he said, the galaxy finds out exactly what kind of species they decided to underestimate. I did not know it then, but somewhere far across the stars, in a chamber built to house calm, measured discussions between ancient and powerful civilizations, delegates from 100 worlds were about to watch recorded footage of what had happened at Threshold Station for the very first time. And for the first time since the Galactic Council had been founded, nobody in that chamber would know what to say. I was summoned to appear before the Galactic Council 11 days after the engagement at Threshold Station. A request delivered through official channels with a formality that felt almost absurd given everything that had happened. Admiral Doyle could not attend himself, occupied as he was with coordinating the ongoing recovery efforts at Meridian, so the task fell to me, the officer who had commanded our flagship during the operation and who now found herself standing before representatives of 100 worlds inside a chamber I had only ever seen in briefing recordings. Claire Whitfield, our lead diplomatic attaché, walked beside me through the long corridor leading into the main assembly hall. She had spent years working within council institutions, navigating the careful, layered politics that governed every interaction between member species, and I could tell from the tension in her shoulders that even she was uncertain what to expect from this particular session. They watched the footage 3 times before calling this meeting, Claire said quietly as we approached the chamber doors. Some delegates wanted it suppressed entirely, others wanted it shown to every council member individually. The chamber itself was larger than I had imagined, a vast circular room filled with representatives from species I recognized only from diplomatic briefings, their forms varied and unfamiliar, their expressions in most cases impossible for me to read. What I could read, clearly, was the tension that filled the room the moment I stepped inside. The presiding officer, an elder representative from a species called the Ossuron, addressed me directly without the usual introductory formalities that typically opened council sessions. Commander Elena Voss, the Ossuran representative said, her translated voice carrying a weight that suggested she had rehearsed these words carefully. You commanded the human vessel responsible for the engagement at what your species designates as Threshold Station. The Council has reviewed extensive sensor data from that engagement. We require your testimony regarding the decisions made during that operation. I remember standing there, aware of every eye in that chamber fixed on me, and choosing my words with a care I had not expected to need. I commanded that operation under direct orders from Earth Defense Command, I said. Our objective was the complete removal of the Dominion's ability to reinforce or resupply forces occupying our colony at Meridian. We accomplished that objective. A representative from a species I later learned were called the Velkin, a delegation known throughout the Council for their historically aggressive military traditions, rose from her seat with an expression that I can only describe as something between admiration and disbelief. Your forces demonstrated tactical capability far exceeding any assessment this council previously held regarding human military development, the Velkin representative said. I ask you directly, Commander, was the scale of destruction at Threshold Station a deliberate strategic choice or a failure of restraint? I understood, in that moment, exactly what was being asked of me and exactly why my answer mattered more than almost anything I had said in my life. It was deliberate, I said. Every target selected during that operation was chosen specifically to eliminate the Dominion's capacity for further aggression against our people. We did not choose the scale of that response randomly. We chose it because we understood that anything less would only invite further attacks, against Meridian or against some other human colony in the future. The chamber fell into a silence that stretched long enough for me to hear my own pulse. A different representative, this one from a species called the Thren, known for their long-standing seat on the Council's Ethics Committee, spoke next with a tone that carried clear disapproval. Your response exceeded any proportional standard this Council recognizes for interspecies conflict resolution, the Thren representative said. Council law establishes clear frameworks for measured retaliation. What your forces conducted at Threshold Station falls far outside those frameworks. I felt something harden inside me as I answered, a feeling I recognized from the moment I first learned Meridian had gone silent. With respect, I said, your council frameworks were written by species who have never faced an enemy willing to erase 40,000 civilians and call it a resource claim. Those frameworks assume every conflict can be resolved through careful, measured steps between parties who both value restraint. The Dominion did not offer us restraint. They offered us a filing form. I paused, aware that what I said next would likely be repeated across every council world within days. But once it began, we chose to end it as quickly and as completely as possible, because we understand something that this council, with all its history and all its frameworks, seems to have forgotten. Measured responses only work against opponents who respect measured responses. The Dominion did not respect anything about us until we left them no ability to threaten us further. I do not know how long the silence lasted after that, long enough that I began to wonder if I had said something that would end whatever fragile relationship humanity still had with the wider council. It was a representative from an unexpected source who finally broke that silence, a delegate from a small, quiet species called the Pharaoh, historically one of the least influential voices within council proceedings, a species that had, according to Claire's earlier briefing, suffered their own losses at the hands of aggressive expansionist powers decades before humanity ever arrived among the stars. Perhaps, the Pharaoh representative said slowly, this council has spent so many centuries protecting the comfort of its oldest members that it has forgotten what true deterrence requires. The chamber erupted into overlapping conversation after that, dozens of voices speaking at once, in languages my translator struggled to keep pace with. I stood there at the center of it, watching 100 worlds argue about what humanity had become, and understanding, for the first time, that the outcome of this conversation would shape how every species in this galaxy treated us for generations to come. The presiding Asuran representative eventually restored order, calling for a formal recess before any further proceedings would continue. Claire guided me out of the chamber, her expression difficult to read, and I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I walked through those doors. "What happens now?" I asked. Claire did not answer immediately. She led me to a quiet observation room overlooking the chamber floor, where we could see delegates still gathered in smaller groups, clearly continuing arguments that had spilled out beyond the formal session. "Some of them are terrified of us now," Claire finally said. "Others are already trying to figure out how quickly they can secure a formal alliance before someone else does." I asked her which reaction concerned her more. "Neither," Claire said, with a faint, tired smile. "What concerns me is that both reactions come from the same realization. They finally understand what we are capable of, and now every decision they make about Earth going forward will be shaped by that fear." Over the following days, I watched from a distance as the political situation continued to shift in ways that none of us had fully anticipated. Formal complaints were filed by several Dominion-allied species, demanding sanctions against Earth for what they termed disproportionate military action. At the same time, quiet diplomatic overtures began arriving from species who had previously ignored humanity almost entirely, delegations suddenly expressing interest in trade agreements, defense pacts, and mutual security arrangements. Daniel Pierce, monitoring incoming council communications from aboard the Meridian's Answer, remarked one evening that it felt as though the entire balance of galactic politics had shifted overnight, purely because one species had finally shown it was willing to respond to aggression with absolute, uncompromising resolve. I remember Grace asking me, during one of the quieter moments after my testimony, whether I regretted anything I had said before the council. I told her the truth. I did not regret a single word. What I did carry with me, in the weeks that followed, was the weight of understanding exactly what Earth had become in the eyes of the galaxy. We were no longer the quiet, easily dismissed newcomers who had first arrived at the council table hoping to be welcomed as equals among older, wiser civilizations. We had become something else entirely, a species whose response to aggression was now understood, across 100 worlds, to be total, immediate, and without any patience for half measures. Whether that reputation would serve us well in the years ahead remained, at that moment, an open question. But one thing had become undeniably clear during those tense days before the council. Nobody in the galaxy would ever again assume humanity could be threatened without consequence. And somewhere among the Dominion's remaining leadership, word was already spreading about exactly what had happened at Threshold Station, a warning far more effective than anything the Council's careful, measured frameworks could ever have produced. 3 months passed before Meridian Colony was fully restored, and I spent most of that time shuttling between the recovery effort and a growing list of diplomatic obligations that none of us had ever expected to face. Earth had gone, almost overnight, from a species the Council barely acknowledged to one that every major power now wanted to understand, court, or carefully avoid provoking. I returned to Meridian personally during the final stages of the restoration project, walking through streets that engineers like Owen Marsh had worked tirelessly to rebuild. Families who had been evacuated during the initial crisis were beginning to return, and I remember standing in what had once been the colony's central square, watching children play in a space that had been a battlefield only months earlier. Grace Hollis found me there, having just finished coordinating the final security handover with the small garrison Earth had permanently stationed at the colony. "It does not feel real yet," she said, looking around at the rebuilt structures, "like we are just waiting for something else to happen." I understood exactly what she meant. Something had shifted in all of us since Threshold Station, a kind of vigilance that no amount of rebuilding could fully erase. The political consequences of our response continued to unfold in ways that surprised even our most experienced diplomats. Claire Whitfield reported that formal delegations from no fewer than 14 previously indifferent species had reached out to Earth's diplomatic corps within the first month after my council testimony, each proposing some form of security cooperation or mutual defense arrangement. Some of these approaches came from genuine respect for what humanity had demonstrated. Others, Claire suspected, came from a far more practical calculation, an understanding that aligning closely with Earth might prove safer than remaining a potential target for whatever conflict came next. The Dominion itself underwent significant internal upheaval in the months following Threshold Station. Intelligence gathered through Council channels suggested that Fleet Commander Vresk, the officer who had requested a ceasefire during our engagement, faced serious consequences from his own leadership for what they considered an embarrassing defeat at the hands of a species they had dismissed as insignificant. Reports indicated growing division within Dominion military leadership regarding future policy toward Earth, with some factions arguing for renewed aggression to restore their reputation, and others insisting that humanity now represented a threat too costly to provoke again. I remember Laura Bennett presenting a detailed intelligence briefing on this internal Dominion conflict during one of our final strategy sessions before I returned to Earth for an extended period of leave. Her assessment, delivered with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the entire crisis, offered a perspective that stuck with me long afterward. "They are not afraid of losing another battle," Laura said. "They are afraid of losing another battle to us specifically, because now they understand exactly what that would cost them." The Galactic Council, for its part, never fully resolved the debate that had erupted following my testimony. Some member species continued pushing for formal sanctions against Earth, citing concerns about establishing dangerous precedents for future conflicts. Others quietly began treating humanity with a level of caution and respect that our diplomats had never experienced before, inviting Earth representatives to security discussions and strategic planning sessions previously reserved for the Council's oldest and most established powers. I recall a conversation with Claire during one of my final days at Meridian, sitting together on a rebuilt observation platform overlooking the colony's newly restored central district. "Do you think they respect us now?" I asked her, "or do they just fear us?" Claire considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps both," she said. "Perhaps that is simply what respect looks like among species who have spent their entire history assuming strength is measured only by age and size. We showed them something different. We showed them that strength can also be measured by how completely a species is willing to defend what matters to them." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over during the quiet moments of my journey back to Earth, aboard the Meridian's Answer, the ship that had carried us through everything since that first alarm had pulled me out of sleep months earlier. Nathan Cole, now serving as one of our most experienced combat pilots despite his relative youth, joined me on the bridge during the final approach toward Earth orbit. He had grown noticeably during the months since Threshold Station, carrying himself with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. "Do you think this is over?" he asked me, watching Earth grow larger on our main display. I told him the truth, the same truth I had been carrying since my testimony before the council. "I do not think conflict like this is ever fully over," I said. "But I think we proved something that this galaxy needed to understand. We proved that humanity will never again be treated as an easy target, and that any species considering aggression against us will need to accept a cost far higher than they are willing to pay." Nathan nodded slowly, then asked a question that surprised me with its simplicity. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Everything we had to become to make that point?" I did not answer immediately. I thought about Meridian's central square, about the families who had returned to rebuild their lives. I thought about the weight of standing before 100 worlds and defending decisions that would follow humanity for generations to come. I thought about Threshold Station and the officers we had allowed to flee rather than pursuing complete destruction, a small mercy buried within an otherwise merciless response. "I do not know if worth it is the right way to measure it," I finally said. "But I know that our people are safe now in a way they were not safe before, and I know that no other species in this galaxy will make the same mistake the Dominion made. That has to count for something." When we finally arrived back at Earth, I was greeted not with celebration, but with a quiet, solemn recognition from Earth Defense Command leadership that felt far more appropriate given everything we had been through. Admiral Doyle met me personally at the primary orbital dock, looking older than he had months earlier, though his expression carried a quiet satisfaction that I had not seen from him since before Meridian first went silent. "You did well before the council," he told me. "Better than I could have managed myself." I told him I had simply said what needed to be said. "Sometimes," Doyle replied, "that is exactly what leadership requires." In the years that followed, Earth's position within the wider galactic community continued to evolve in ways that none of us could have fully predicted during those tense early days after Meridian's fall. We were no longer treated as the newest, weakest voice at the council table. We had earned, through cost that none of us would ever fully forget, a seat that other species now approached with genuine caution and, in many cases, genuine respect. The Dominion never again attempted direct aggression against human territory, whether this restraint came from fear, from internal political instability, or from a simple recalculation of costs versus benefits. I never learned for certain. What I did know was that every diplomatic exchange between our two species from that point forward carried an unspoken understanding that had not existed before Threshold Station, an understanding built on the clear demonstration that humanity would respond to any future aggression with the same absolute resolve. I think often about that first alarm, the one that pulled me out of sleep and set everything else into motion. I think about the version of myself who stood on that bridge, staring at empty screens where a colony used to be, uncertain of what humanity would do next. I did not know then what we were capable of becoming when everything we valued was threatened. None of us did. What I know now, standing years removed from those events, is that the galaxy learned something about humanity during those difficult months that no amount of diplomatic negotiation could ever have taught them. They learned that we value peace, but we will not purchase that peace through weakness. They learned that our history of conflict, once seen as evidence of our primitive nature, had instead prepared us for exactly the kind of decisive, uncompromising response that older, more comfortable civilizations had long since forgotten how to deliver. Grace Hollis eventually took command of her own vessel, continuing the work of strengthening Earth's defensive capabilities across the sectors surrounding our territory. Laura Bennett went on to help design the strategic doctrine that would guide Earth Defense Command for decades to come, built entirely around the lessons learned during those critical months following Meridian's fall. Nathan Cole became one of the most respected combat instructors in our fleet, training a new generation of pilots who would grow up understanding, from the very beginning of their service, exactly what humanity was willing to do to protect what mattered most. As for myself, I continued serving as one of Earth's primary voices within council proceedings, carrying forward the same principle that had guided my testimony during those tense early days. We would seek peace wherever possible, cooperation wherever it served our people, and diplomacy as our first and preferred approach to every challenge the galaxy presented. But we would never again allow any species to mistake that preference for weakness. The Galactic Council, for all its ancient wisdom and careful, measured traditions, had finally encountered a member species willing to answer aggression with absolute, uncompromising resolve. They had watched, through recorded footage that would be studied by military strategists across 100 worlds for generations to come, exactly what happened when humanity decided that half measures were no longer an option. They had expected diplomacy. They had expected patience. They had expected a species too young, too small, and too inexperienced to respond with anything beyond formal complaints and careful negotiation. What they received instead left an entire chamber of ancient, powerful civilizations utterly speechless, and ensured that no species in this galaxy would ever again make the mistake of underestimating what humanity was truly capable of when everything we valued was placed under threat.